All right, so I've got your image file up here. This is your original stack. And we're going to run through just some really basic stuff that you can do in GIMP to pull out some of those details and maintain that color balance, because the picture that was posted was kind of on the green side. So I'll show you a couple things you can do to watch for that color balance. So first thing I'm going to do with your picture here is I'm going to go into the colors menu and I'm going to do what's called a threshold. And a threshold, what it does is it looks for the brightest and darkest parts of the image and it colors them as black and white. And as you drag this pointer around, you'll begin to start to see it just maxes out some of those brighter areas in the image. As you get closer and closer, there's a little peak here. If I bring that back over, see that peak? As I bring this over, right, I get close to that, you're starting to see more and more of that stuff come out. I found if you go too far, it just blows everything out, right? You go past that peak. So you have to find the right spot. I found around 0.04 for this particular image was pretty close. You could try 0.039. And notice how, again, it's really blowing out all of the stuff that's lighter, but it leaves everything else that's dark black, and it helps you find those really dark spots to really identify what in the image truly is black and what is not, what's maybe a gray or something like that. So I'm going to look maybe up in this corner here, right? This area in here has some areas that are truly, truly dark. So I don't actually want to put this threshold here, but I'm going to leave it on for now. And we're going to use what are called sample points. I've turned on the sample points panel here. You can do that through Windows, dockable dialogues, and then down here you have sample points. And sample points will let you monitor those locations where you drop points. So I'm going to hold the control key and click off of the ruler here on the top. And you'll see how it brings in these little axes. I'm going to place this in an area that I believe is going to be a good representation of really being black. So here's a pretty good area, right? That general spot there. And once I do that and I have this position, I can adjust the marker to show different types of values. So what I want to use is RGB 0 to 255. Because that's going to show me 0 is totally black, 255 is maxed out as totally white, or the max end of each range, R, G, and B. And so that's going to help me monitor the color balance as I start tweaking stuff. Now, if I cancel the threshold, you should see color values show up there, because now it's not just black and white, it's actually RGB data. And I can see that they're slightly off from each other, but we'll balance those out. I also want to add a second monitor point, usually on another star that's fairly bright. And that's going to set what we call the white point. And so I'm going to find one of these stars that's really bright and drop a spot right in the middle of it here. And again, I'm going to set that to RGB 0 to 255. And you can see that it's almost all the way at the top of the range, 255. We got 253, 249, 250. That means that this is almost exactly pure white. I'm going to just readjust that point. Now undo that real quick. I think I bumped it just a hair. That's okay. But again, having that be so high in value, basically it negates a lot of the color because it's practically pure white at that point. So there's not much we'll be able to do with that particular star. But often what you can do is watch other stars and make sure as you stretch your image, you don't blow them out being totally white. You want to keep some of the color in some of your other stars. So maybe I'll look at another star that's kind of in the same area here and add something there and just keep an eye on it and see what it does. And here you can see that third point is a little bit lower, which is great. So that one's probably going to end up being a little bit more yellow than the other ones. But now I can go ahead and start the process of stretching the image data. You're already set to 16-bit, which is great. If you had a 32-bit image, you would want to switch that to 16-bit. You could try and stretch it and work it a little bit before you convert it, and that's okay. But we'll go into, the first thing I'm going to do is adjust levels. And I'm going to balance out that black point that I chose. Now your image is a bit dark, and that could be just because of the exposure time that you have. Maybe using a longer exposure time would bring some of that up a bit more. Otherwise, it could also just be, yeah, it's pretty much just exposure time or lower ISO or whatever. So ideally you'd want that histogram to be a little bit farther in, probably like a quarter to a third of the way in. So watch when you're taking your sub exposures, you want to try and get your exposure so that it's a little bit farther in on that histogram. So you'll have to turn the histogram on the back of your camera on using the info button, and that should help. But so for your image, I'm going to drag this middle point. This is your midtones. I'm going to drag this a little bit over just to brighten up the image a bit. And you see how that black point, those RGB values are starting to come up a little bit. And that's great. So I might play with that just a little, just to brighten up the image. Normally, again, I would probably try to avoid doing that, but this is just so dark that I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. So I've adjusted that, right? And now I can go in and do levels individually. So I'm going to do red, green, and blue separately. If you're trying to move them all as a group, you might do them together. Just move the total value. You can move this in a little bit. And I usually shoot for an RGB value of around probably 25 to 30 as I'm processing, and then I'll drop it a little bit at the very end. So I'll bring that in just a tiny bit, and then I'll adjust. So I'm going to switch to red, and again we'll bring that in, and I can watch that, see that red value beginning to drop. I'm going to play with that until it drops to, I'm gonna actually just pull that all the way in so it drops to match the blue value, which is 27. A little too far. There. So now I can see red and green and blue are both 27. I still have to change my green, so I'm going to bring the green in a bit here. That's too far. 25, 27. There we go. So I'm at about 27 for each one of these. And what that does is it sets that black point so that it's a nice flat black or dark gray, really, in that spot. So that spot is now a dark gray, so that it's, a really sort of neutral tone. And you could do the same thing with the white side of things too. So if you're watching for the white point on some of your stars, you'd ideally want to watch it on one of the stars that's really bright, that's a blue star, that's a bit more on the white side. The yellow stars, you'd want to try and avoid that because you want to keep that yellow color rather than making it flat or making it white or gray. So in this case, the RGB, they're really close. By the time I'm done and I'm stretching these, they're probably all going to be the same anyway, but I'll try it anyway. And so for green, bring that down just a little bit, right? Now it's 254. And blue, we'll bring that down a little bit. Again, until we hit 254, right? So now they're all the same. Again, that helps. It's amazing what a little adjustment like that does to get your color balance just right. It really does help a lot. And a small change, like one number, one digit change in RGB on the high or low side can actually make quite a difference sometimes. So now I'm going to start stretching. So I'm going to go into curves, and I'm going to start stretching out the image. And you'll notice it's really hard to see because there's a super thin little peak right here. That's where your data is. We're going to begin to stretch that out. So I'm going to grab the curve here and just begin to pull. And you don't want to go super nuts with this. We're going to pull enough to start seeing more information. You can start to see the galaxy showing there. Watch our RGB values. As you do this, you want to keep an eye on that and go back and readjust as you go. Each time, I'm going to go back to levels. I'm going to bring that level in a little bit, right? Bring it back down. we were using 27. So I'm just going to stick with 27 just to be consistent here. Right, I'm going to go ahead and adjust each one of these. So I can get that value the same. So I'm going to keep bringing that up. There we go. There's green and blue. Adjust that until I get 27. There we go. So I got 27. Okay, so I got 27s across the board. My white point is still nice and even, all at 254s, and we'll just keep doing this process. So I'm going to go back to curves and colors and curves, and we'll just stretch it some more. And this time, as I stretch, I pull some of that out. I'm going to go ahead and bring the dark side, the black point, down just a little bit and create more of an S shape. Again, doing it a little bit at a time. Don't go super crazy with it, because if you overstretch it, you start to really introduce some graininess, some noise into your image. Go back to levels. Going to bring this back up again. Make sure I bring those levels back down to 27. So that's what we were, had it. There we are, 27. Right. So just trying to be consistent there. And then just keep doing this, right? And you don't have to do it a ton. I usually go 3-4 times at least. But you can start to see your galaxy starting to show here. Again, I'll just keep making these little S curves. And what you'll see is that in your histogram, that needle point, that high spike of data, is beginning to stretch out. It's beginning to widen a little bit. So the more we keep stretching, the more that's going to happen. And again, just going back to levels, changing this back down, 27, perfect, there we go. Go back to curves, stretch it some more. Right, now we're starting to see your galaxy coming out. And it's just kind of eyeballing, right? It's a bit of an art getting that stretch. You just start to get an eye for it as you go. And I'm still learning a lot about doing this myself, so don't consider me an expert by any means. But it's something that I've started to work on as I process my pictures. And here you can see I got 27s, but green is a little bit off here. So what I might do is leave these just a touch high. And or just work from there, right? So now I've got 28s, and then I've got green is 27, so there's just a tiny imbalance. And I'll just bring these back in. There we go. So curves, doing it one more time, bring it back in. Notice that histogram, see how wide that is now? Really broaden that out. That's great, that's what we want to see. Again, starting to stretch that data out some more. Watching my levels. They're actually pretty good right here. So I'm going to go ahead and leave them. And we'll stretch one more time. Oops, not levels. We're going to do curves. Let's stretch once more here. You can see how kind of orangey, reddish that is, right? And that's, you can start to now really see the gradient. And this is probably from some light pollution in the area, is my guess. You might have had some light sources, or maybe you were near a town or something like that. You said you were Bortle 3 skies, so my guess is there's some houses or some other stuff nearby causing a bit of light pollution. So the ground is probably down towards this corner, is my guess. There are ways to fix that. I'm not real familiar with GIMP personally, so I don't know the best way to fix that using GIMP. I do know that in Photoshop there's a plugin called Gradient Exterminator that can be used, And that's a really easy tool to flatten out your background and kill those gradients. And that really makes a big difference in the quality of your pictures too. It makes them just look nicer in general. But again, you might be able to try and do something in GIMP. You might have to search around for how to reduce or eliminate gradients in GIMP. There's also a spot here. That is probably some dust in your imaging train on the sensor, on your lens, something that is blocking some of the light or causing an artifact in the image. And using flats are really going to help eliminate that kind of stuff. It's almost impossible to get rid of all the dust. And as you stretch the image data, you're going to see these dust motes come out. So start considering taking some flats as you go. And that's just going to help to reduce those dust spots. It'll also help to reduce vignetting around the corners. So vignetting is that darkening in the corners, basically because you have a lens that's round, but you have a rectangular sensor. So the corners tend to be a little darker. And you can see that up in this upper right corner. It's a little darker here than it is in the other areas. But lastly, I did notice you have stars in all of your corners. See how they're stretched out, and they're stretching out from away from the center, and you can see that in the lower right. They're stretched away from the center of the image. Same in the lower left, stretched away from the center of the image. They're turned into little ovals. That's going to be coma. If you're using a lens, there's not a whole lot you can do with that. When you have a telescope, you could add in a field flattener. So if you're using a telescope and it looked like, I think you were using a telescope, you may want to consider adding a field flattener into your imaging train. Smaller scopes, they're not usually too expensive. Might be a couple $100, but that should make all those stars nice and round, nice little pinpoints all the way to the edges of the field of view. So again, I'm going to look at those RGB values, go back to my levels, just adjust that. So my red is a little high, my blue is a little high. So I'm going to adjust those. Just bring those back in. There we go. Now we're back to 30. And my blue, we'll bring that in. There we go. We're back to 30. And then I might go in and bring that black point down a bit. So now, since we're getting kind of closer to the end, what I might do is bring that in a little bit farther, maybe down to like 20. 20 is not bad. You don't want it to be totally black because otherwise it looks a little bit fake if it's so black. You also, if you drag this in too far, you'd be clipping the data that's at the dark end. And so you start to lose some of that faint information. So you don't want to go too far in with that. You want to leave that so you have a little bit of leeway and you don't lose some of those details. And then again, that's just a matter of personal preference there. So hopefully that helps. You can see the galaxy here. It's mostly sort of orangey yellow. And that's often just because it's a lot of luminosity information, but there's not a ton of color. And that's just because one-shot color cameras only have 1 out of 4 pixels that are blue, 1 out of 4 pixels that are red, and then 2 out of 4 pixels are actually green because green is less sensitive. So they're trying to balance that out, but that means that when you're trying to capture blue, and you've probably noticed that M33 is often noticeably blue because they're younger, brighter stars, they burn hotter, they're blue. In that case, then getting that blue to come out is more difficult, and that usually comes with more imaging time. So the more exposure data you get, the stronger the blue begins to pile up as you stack, right? It starts to amplify that blue a bit more. And you can start to see it a little bit out in the tails of these spiral arms. There's a little bit of what appears to be aqua or blue in there. And that will become more prominent as you get more imaging time, more sub-exposures. So something to consider. is just adding more and more data to your image. So we could crop this down, and you could continue to play with this if you wanted. And there are other ways that you can adjust your image to adjust the color balance a bit in there. But you can adjust that with crop. I've got a 3:2 ratio in here because that's a pretty standard ratio, or you could adjust that to, if you want to print it, you could do 10:8. So we do 10:8, right? Because that's going to be an 8:10 picture frame. So that way you'll get, the right aspect ratio for that type of picture frame. Right? So I can crop that, position that where I want, hit enter, and now you've got your cropped image there. So I might put together another quick video, and that's just going to be maybe using Photoshop. GIMP is great, it is free, but there aren't as many plugins and other tools available for GIMP at this point. So I consider it a bit of a basic image editor. As you go and get more experience, you might want some more advanced tools. So like right now I'm using Photoshop, which is sort of an intermediate step. I've got some plugins that I've purchased for Photoshop specifically to adjust Astro images, and they've made a world of difference in my pictures. But again, it's not free. You could do the Photoshop Lightroom bundle for $10 a month and then add the plugins, which I think were another $50 to $70 total between the two sets of plugins that I bought. But it's just something to consider. But you can keep using GIMP for now and see if you can hone your skills, really get some more of this data to come out. And I think you're on the right track here. This looks pretty good for the short amount of exposure time that you have, and using a camera lens without a flattener versus a telescope. This is, or actually I believe you are using a telescope. But either way, this is a great start. So nice job, and hopefully you found this to be helpful.